Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Today's subject is immigration, and joining me today is Lisa Johnson-Firth of Immigrants First, PLLC. Thank you so much for joining me, Lisa.
Thank you for having me here.
So in your work as an immigration attorney, you have a lot of experience, and lately you have been doing a presentation called Know Your Rights. And I'd like for you to talk to our viewers a little bit about the rights that immigrants have, basic rights, and how you advise people, and also to remind them too that if they are part of an organization that would benefit from having this presentation, knowing more about the legal rights of people in our country, that they can contact you to make that presentation.
Sure, they absolutely can. We do a lot of Know Your Rights presentations, and you can find us on the web at Immigrants First. And it is really important that people understand some basics of their rights in this country and their obligations. But in this day and age where ICE is enforcing immigration more than they ever have in the past, it's important that people know how to interact with the police and with ICE. So if you're driving a car in the state of Virginia, obviously you have to have a driver's license. A lot of people have Maryland licenses or out-of-state licenses. Those are fine, but if you've lived in Virginia for more than 30 days, you're obligated to get a Virginia license, and the police may question you about your address. If you are stopped, be polite, cooperate, hands on the steering wheel, turn the light on in your car. You're not obligated to answer any questions except your name. So Virginia is a name-only state. We advise clients that although they should have a current passport, that they not carry any foreign ID on their person. If they're searched, the police will apprehend the passport and won't return it. If they're out of status, you won't get your passport back until the end of the immigration proceeding. Wow. So, and it's prima facie evidence that you're a foreign national. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a Mexican passport. So it's really important to not carry a foreign ID document around with you, but to certainly have it at home and to keep a copy of that document at home. So if you're stopped, you have a right to remain silent, but it's important to be aware that you could be charged with obstruction of justice if you're not answering the police questions.
So they expect you to be cooperative.
They do expect you to be cooperative. They expect you to answer their questions. But everything you say can and will be held against you. And if you admit that you're from Mexico and you crossed the border 10 years ago, well, then you've kind of handed over to the government the evidence that they need to begin essentially a removal proceeding against you if you don't have legal status in the United States. So legal status, let me just take a moment to explain. That is when people have a right to be here. They have a non-immigrant visa, they may have a green card, they could have temporary protected status or the DACA, the deferred action status for children. They may have just had an asylum grant. So there's lots of ways that people can have a legal status in the United States. And then there's lots of people who don't have legal status in the U.S.
So I heard just part of President Obama's speech in Chicago the other day, and he was talking about people overstaying their visas. Mm-hmm. So we tend to think of all immigrants as being basically Hispanic. Mm-hmm. Let's just be clear on that. When people talk about illegal immigrants, they have this dominant narrative about who they are and what they look like. But there's a lot of people, if I'm not wrong, there are people who come on tourist visas or other visas and simply overstay their visa. They are also without a legal status to be in this country.
That is correct. I lived in Boston. I went to law school in Boston, and there were a lot of out-of-status Irish people and Italian people that we don't usually think of as immigrants because they blend in more to our community.
So this is where profiling comes into play. It really does. I mean, the fact that somebody like you or me would likely not be pulled over if we were pulled over for a traffic stop, that people would immediately go directly to, oh, I wonder if they're legally here. Right? We have a driver's license, and so probably nobody will ever question that. But when we talk about illegal immigration, how many people truly are here without status that are not the narrative of Hispanics? Let's just put that out there. And when the Trump administration says they want to do something about illegal immigration, is he at all talking about those other people?
I have not heard affirmative steps to stop people coming in on a tourist visa and then, monitoring those visas. We don't have a good system in this country of alerting our government authorities if you overstay your visa. It's kind of we trust you once you're here that you'll leave when you say you're going to leave. So I haven't heard as much emphasis on that. What he is obviously emphasizing is stopping the flow of people crossing the border, which has its own issues. Most of those people coming into the United States are refugees. They're not even economic refugees anymore. They are refugees from extraordinary gang violence south of our border. And it's going to be very difficult to stop that flow unless we stop the violence that's pushing all the women and especially children coming into the United States. So that's certainly one concern. Terrorism is another concern, so that's why we've got the 6 countries that he has tried very adamantly to have a travel ban on. And of course that raises issues of racial profiling, and not every person from those countries is a terrorist. He is emphasizing that any person who is essentially out of status with even a minor criminal charge, not a conviction, just a charge, is now a priority for removal, and that is a great departure from Obama's administration, where there were clear priorities of who was removable, and there was an acknowledgement that the government cannot deport over 11 million undocumented persons in the United States, and that we're going to prioritize these by severity of their criminal record or the risk to public safety. Under Trump, all of that has gone by the wayside, and if you're out of status, which means your visa's expired, or you cross the border without inspection, or your TPS is run out, you're out of status. And if you've got even just a minor charge, drunk in public, for instance, you are now a high priority for removal.
What about the mother in Ohio? That was a very high, the media really gave a lot of airtime to this mother who in Ohio, and she had been checking in with her immigration for 10 years, and then and she's got children that were born here, and they up and decided it was just time to deport her. And I think this really took a lot of people in this country by surprise, because that's not what we had understood were going to be the priorities. I mean, how do you think people who have never been focused on the issue of immigration up to this point are reacting to stories like that?
I think, from an immigration lawyer perspective, we as a society have to understand that we do have immigration laws in place. And if you are here out of status, it's not a criminal incident that you're here out of status, but it is a civil charge against you that you're here out of status, and you are removable. And I think we've had many years where ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was not really enforcing those laws that we have that are civil, not criminal. Immigration law is largely civil, but you're removable. And unless you can put up a defense to your removal that you qualify for asylum, or there's a family member who could file a petition for you, you're deportable. Even if you don't have a criminal record, you're deportable just because you are here out of status. But because we have, for so many years, allowed people to remain, and part of that is Congress's fault, that we have 3 and 10-year bars, that once you're here and you're here without status, it's almost impossible to leave and then come back because now you're barred. So in many ways, we have created this problem through our government laws and policies, where we've trapped a lot of people here that otherwise would have left, but they can't leave because then they wouldn't be able to come back for 10 years.
See, that's the first time I have heard of that. That is the first time that I have heard that we have trapped people here.
Our very own laws have created a situation where if you have unlawful presence for more than 1 year in the United States, so let's say I come on a tourist visa from Germany, and I just remain here, and I'm here out of status, or maybe I came as a student, and I've now been here for 9 years. I've acquired 9 years of unlawful presence. So if I go back to Germany to visit my relatives, and then I want to then return to the United States because I have a job here, I pay taxes, I own a home, I can't come back. I've been barred for 10 years unless I do what's called a waiver or ask for a pardon from the US government. So that is, the immigration programs that we had in the 50s and 60s, the Bracera program, where agriculturalists would come, they'd pick our crops, and they'd go back to Mexico, and really they lived in Mexico, they would come here to work. We had a flexible border patrol policy, and people could come and go as we needed them to come and go. That is no longer the case. So now once you're here, you can't leave unless you plan to not come back for at least 10 years.
Well, that's a newsflash to me, and so probably undoubtedly is to a lot of other people. So what we really need to do is look to Congress to basically update, revamp, and overhaul these laws that are clearly ineffective. There
are some very penalizing laws that were passed, and ironically, under the Bill Clinton administration. A lot of some of the most egregious laws that we have in immigration were passed under his administration, that being one of them. Another one is called the permanent bar, that if you're here out of status and you leave the United States either because you're deported or you leave on your own volition and then you return illegally by crossing the border without inspection, you now have a 10-year bar that you can't even waive. It's not even waivable. So it's amazing how many families are permanently parted because of that permanent bar. Or the fact that you have to file an asylum case within 1 year coming to the United States. That means an immigrant who's been tortured and persecuted and has no money and came with a shirt on their back has to have the wherewithal to figure out, oh, I have to claim asylum within 1 year and find a lawyer to do that for me, or you can be barred from claiming asylum. There's some limited exceptions to that, but the fact is, for the most part, you have to file asylum within 1 year. And then a lot of our criminal provisions became very enforced and strict in the 1990s, which has also created major immigration issues.
So, and one of the things I want to do in our second segment is talk about the difference between people who come here as refugees seeking asylum and how that there is a process for that, because we've also heard with the issue in Syria that emotions are running very high about people coming into our country, even if they come in through what I would call a legal process of trying to claim that they are political refugees or seeking asylum. Mm-hmm. So when we come back, I will talk with Lisa a little bit about the different kinds of immigrants we have in our country and how it's often difficult for us who are not immigration experts either to sort out what we're hearing in the media and on the news, because we are living in communities where every day we touch people who may look or sound or appear to us to possibly be in this category. And the dominant narrative in this country right now is that we should all be, wary of illegal immigrants in our communities. But I would suggest that we need to give this a lot more thought. So please join me after the break when we'll be talking with Lisa Johnson-Firth of Immigrants First, PLLC, and she will get us up to speed on this.
Everything starts out small. The things that hurt us, they all start from somewhere. The words we say, the things we do, they can grow into something else. What was small and innocent can become big and sometimes scary. All it takes is one comment, one picture, one video for something to catch fire. But a big problem doesn't need a big response. Not at first. Even if we don't know what to say, the eye emoji can be that first step we take. Let's all pledge to take that first small step together and change the world in a big way. I'm a witness, and so are you.
Thanks for joining me here on Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. We're talking about immigration today with Lisa Johnson-Firth of Immigrants First, LLC. I so appreciate you being here, Lisa.
Thank you.
So you were telling me stuff I've never heard before, but I do know that there are different statuses for how people come into this country. And refugees has also been a hot button issue around this country, as some communities have even taken steps to say that they refuse to have immigrants in their community. Radford, Virginia leaps to mind because their city council seems to have been preemptive in saying, we don't want these people here. But what is that process? How, to me, it's very difficult. I've heard it's extremely difficult to go through the vetting process to come into this country through that doorway.
It's a sad state of affairs, and if we would have had these policies after World War II, we wouldn't have many valuable people that live in this country. The United States signed on to international conventions where we are obligated under international law and under our own U.S. law to provide sanctuary for persons who are fleeing persecution and violence in their countries. So the definition of a refugee is someone who has suffered past persecution or has a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of things like their political opinion, race, nationality, religion, membership in a social group. And they not only have a rigorous process to show that they qualify under the definition of a refugee, which is a strict legal definition with a lot of case law defining it, but they also go through intense security background checks. They're fingerprinted, all their biometrics are taken. They go through a thorough screening process to make sure that they're not subject to certain bars of asylum, like there is a terrorist bar, for instance, or if you have serious crimes in your background, you won't qualify for asylum even if you're a refugee. You may qualify for a limited form of relief under the Convention Against Torture, but those cases are rare and extreme and are not granted very often. And so really for most asylees, they have gone through a rigorous process. And if you're outside of the United States, you're classed as a refugee, you're processed outside of the US, and then by the time you enter, you've been thoroughly vetted and have legal status as a refugee when you come into the United States, and you can apply for a green card. If you're in the United States, let's say you came on a tourist visa, and then you decide that you just can't bear going back to your country, you might face severe persecution. You were a political party leader, or you might be a woman who's facing female genital mutilation, something like that. You can claim asylum in the United States and go through a similar vetting process.
But what percentage would you say of people who apply are actually granted that status?
I don't know the sort of outside statistics internationally. In a lot of immigration courts around the United States, if you're applying defensively, which means you've been placed in removal proceedings, the figures for some immigration courts can be as low as 20% are granted asylum relief. So relatively low, given the extreme hardship and persecution that many of these people legitimately have, but because they don't fall into this narrow definition of what asylum is, they don't qualify, or they may have disqualifying criminal history or other background issues.
So Terry was talking about the fact that they have at the Centerville Labor Resource Center a population of Guatemalans. And you generally find in Northern Virginia, people think of Hispanics as being Mexicans. We've heard a lot about the Mexican border and the Mexican wall, but there's actually in this area a number of Central American communities, Bolivians, people from Honduras, people from Guatemala, and they tend to gravitate into communities much like immigrants have for the entirety of the U.S. history. The Irish live together, and the Irish and the Eastern European Jewish community, people cluster together in communities of people that they know who have similar customs. So people coming to Central America, particularly to the Northern Virginia area, in many cases we know they are fleeing gang violence, drug violence, but they obviously came through an illegal door. And so now we are looking to send them back, because if I'm hearing you correctly, even trying to be defensive and saying, I want to claim asylum because you're sending me back to this life-threatening situation is not necessarily going to be heard.
So it is an interesting issue that you bring up. The people south of our border are not going to get tourist visas for the most part. So if you're claiming asylum from an African country, you will have a lot easier time getting a tourist visa to come into the United States. And so you can have a legal entry into the U.S. But for people who are south of our border, it's almost impossible to get a tourist visa. And so they really have no choice except to cross our border without inspection, or to cross illegally, as most people would say. But many of those people are apprehended at the border, and they're put into a removal process. And under international law and under U.S. law, they have a right to request an interview, a credible fear interview, to be heard by an asylum officer and to make a claim for asylum. And if they're denied by that officer, then they have a right to appeal that decision to an immigration judge. So there is a process at our border, and we also have very large detention facilities at our border. Dilley, Texas comes to mind, where a lot of these women and children, for instance, are held while they wait for their interviews, or they wait to have a bond hearing to release them on bond so that they can be out and about while they have their asylum case pending.
And what is an average stay at a facility like that? How long are people kept there before a determination is made?
It depends. There's certain things that an immigration judge will look at to see if a person is eligible for bond. Do they have a form of legal relief, which would be an asylum case, for instance? Are they a flight risk? So if the judge lets them out, are they just going to disappear into the United States and never, come back for an immigration hearing? Are they a danger to the community? Do they have a sponsor who will help them get established that they can live with and financially sponsor them? So it could take several months for one of those bond hearings to be permitted. So you're waiting for an interview, first of all, to see if you have a legitimate claim for asylum. And then after you pass that interview, if you pass that interview, you are then waiting for a bond hearing with an immigration judge. Sometimes ICE will release people on their own recognizance, especially women with children may be released so that they're not detaining, children for long periods of time in these facilities. But it can be several months.
So there was...
and just one other thing, I guess, if they're not granted bond, because some people have no means to pay a bond, the bonds can be $15,000, $20,000, sometimes $30,000, then they're detained for the duration of their asylum hearing.
So there was at one point, there was a large number of children who were sent across the border unaccompanied. Mm-hmm. And that made the news for a while, but it's a 24/7 news cycle, and once it's off our radar, we just never think about what happened to those kids or if there are any more coming. It's just it's not in our news cycle anymore. But what did happen to a lot of those kids, and are they still coming unaccompanied, or has that dwindled?
No. The numbers have cut back a little bit, but yes, we are still seeing in our office, and I know offices around the United States for immigration lawyers, many unaccompanied minors. I interviewed one this morning. So many are still crossing the border because they have to. They're being pursued by, extremist gang violence participating members. And so they are coming across our borders, and those children are in removal proceedings. If they've been apprehended at the border and they're designated as unaccompanied minors, they're in removal proceedings. So they have the option of filing for special immigrant juvenile status if they've been abused, abandoned, or neglected, or they have the option of filing for asylum. There may be some other form of relief that they qualify for, but for the most part, you're looking at asylum or special immigrant juvenile status.
And are a lot of those unaccompanied minors coming across because they have family here? Is that, are they coming to someone?
A good number have family here that they may be reuniting with, but the impetus usually for most of those children leaving is the violence. So it's not, I would say it's more rare that they're simply coming to reunite with family in the United States. Generally, they are coming because they're fleeing gang violence.
And it's so interesting because, as long as ISIS is in our headlines and of the terrible things that are happening to the Syrians, we can recognize that violence because we see it every day. The violence that is happening in Central America is not on our television screens. It's not being reported. It's not in our face showing us the horrendous situation that these kids and their families are fleeing from. So we give more weight to the thing that we can see versus the weight to the thing that's invisible to us. Mm-hmm. How do we overcome that?
I wish that was not the case because the United States has a long and sordid past in Central America. We have been a major participant in the creation of a lot of the conditions of the gangs that were created, the civil wars that created gang members, the poverty, the destabilization of the governments there. All of that we have had a heavy hand in. And so it's a shame that Americans don't remember more of our history in Central American countries, because a large reason why we have the refugee population fleeing south of our border into the United States is because of our own policies in that region.
That is definitely something is not on a lot of people's radar. Going forward, is the answer to a lot of this legislative revamping of policies And is Congress the place we should be looking for that?
We definitely have some changes to make in our very complicated and overburdened immigration system. And I think we really need to look at our policies south of the border. You know, how can we help, for instance, El Salvador, which is a country that's now been nearly taken over by gangs, stabilize itself and, you know, decrease the corruption? Is it just a matter of throwing money at it? Is it a matter of going in and training government leaders there or training the military in El Salvador? I don't have all the answers. I'm not a foreign policy expert. But I know that this issue of refugees crossing our border is never going to stop, no matter what Congress does, because they have nowhere else to go. They're fleeing for their lives.
And that's it. I mean, and that's been the story of the history of the world since time began, is that wars tear countries apart and people flee violence, poverty, hunger, strife, disease, famine. And the United States, we are a country of immigrants, and we will always be, for the foreseeable future, a place where people want to come. And in some ways, I see that as a positive, that our country has a history that tells people that you can become, you know, I'm not even going to call it the American dream, because I think it's overused, because that dream is different for everybody. Some people just want their children to be safe, you know, to be educated, to have an opportunity to have a life free from poverty and violence. And so I don't ever want the United States to not be that. But I think we have really got to do something about how we are communicating to the world who can come here. And I think Americans need to really examine in our own communities, because we're very diverse here in Northern Virginia. You know, I think at Marshall High School, there's 142 different languages spoken. And maybe that's not that way everywhere in the country, but it is here. And so the county, Fairfax County, the Board of Supervisors, the school board have always embraced that diversity as being something extremely positive that we all learn when we are part of knowing other cultures and people from other cultures.
Well, I think it's also important that we remember that although the immigrants are benefiting by coming here, we benefit by having them here. Most of my clients have a taxpayer ID number. They file their taxes. They're supporting our system. They start businesses. They contribute greatly to our community. And the Council on Foreign Relations did an excellent review of immigration issues and whether we should just deport everyone. And there was a 0.1% gain of having the immigrant population here, which doesn't sound like much, but when you're talking macro statistics like that, you know, to deport those people, the cost of deporting people, the enforcement of it is huge compared to the benefit that we have by having these people here.
And that is a great note on which to end.
Thank you.
There is benefit to the people who are here. We benefit as Americans, and we need to stop and examine how we look at the immigration issue, and that is something that you should know. Thank you for joining us.